Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2013 Advanced. Earlier on in this course we looked at drawing stock charts, and whilst we were doing that we looked at a couple of the main financial sites. And very often within financial websites you'll see tiny little graphs like this one that just demonstrate how the price or value of something has changed, often over a short period of time, but it gives you a very quick visual snapshot of what is happening with a particular value, price or whatever. Now in Excel 2010 Microsoft introduced a tiny little chart type, and unlike other charts and graphs in Excel which are basically drawn over a worksheet, this is a tiny little graph that will fit into an individual worksheet cell. Now these little graphs are called sparklines. They have a very specific purpose. It's pretty much like the purpose of this graph here. It's a quick visual summary of something. You don't have all the detail, you don't have all the formatting capabilities of full charts and graphs, but what you do have is something that will fit into a pretty small space, and which is particularly suitable when you want to compare graphs, several graphs with each other. And I'm going to show you an example of how that would be useful, going back to the sales figures for one of our sales teams that we also looked at earlier in the course. So first of all, what I'm going to do is to insert some sparklines into this worksheet. So I'm going to put them in column B. So I'm going to do an insert so that I get a new column B, and I'm basically going to put some sparklines for team A first. So I'm going to select for team A their cells in column B. Then I go to the insert tab, and there are three types of sparklines. There are line, column and win-loss sparklines. Now I'm going to do line. If I click on line, I get the Create Sparklines dialog. Now for the Create Sparklines dialog, I need to select the data range and then choose where I want the sparklines to be placed. Now on this occasion I've chosen the range where I want them to go first, and now I'm going to select the data range. I could do it the other way around. I could in fact just say insert sparklines without selecting either and then enter both, but I'm going to stick with the fact that I've chosen where the sparklines are going. That's B4 to B8. Now let me select the data. So that's pretty straightforward. That's that data there. C4 to Q8. Click on OK. And if I slide back there, I'll see my little sparklines. Now the thing about these sparklines is that each of them gives you a very simple pattern, a very simple shape, showing how each of my team members' sales have been going during the year. Now what I'm going to do is to zoom in a little bit to make it a little bit easier to understand them. If you look at Andy, the first team member, you can see, like the others, his sales do fluctuate over the year, but you immediately get the impression that actually they're dropping down a little bit. Michael, pretty steady, but more variation later in the year. Douglas, again, generally speaking, the sales seem to be going down. In fact, none of them seem to be doing particularly well, although maybe Jeff's not so bad. But you see how those individual little sparklines immediately give you a quick visual impression of how each team member is doing. Okay, let's insert some more sparklines. Let's try column sparklines this time. So click on column. Brings up the little Create Sparklines dialog again. The data range this time, it defaults to wherever the cursor is. It's A4. I don't want A4. The data, I want the Team B data. I could just type the range in, of course, but I'm going to do it by selection again. So I've selected those, and then the location for the sparklines themselves will be there. Click on OK, and this time I get the alternative style of sparkline with columns. Now once again, each of those little sparklines tells a story. Laura C. Steele, the last person in Team B, seems to be doing the best really, a good couple of months at the end of the year, whereas Eric, the second Eric, seems to be tailing off towards the end of the year. But again, you can see how some people have got better during the year, worse during the year, some have fluctuated wildly. They've all fluctuated quite a bit, they've had strong months, bad months and so on. These are probably quite extreme examples. Within a sales team you'd normally see a fairly regular sort of variation during the year in terms of strengths at certain times of the year and weaknesses at others. But the important thing here is that no matter how different they are, the individual spark lines give you a quick snapshot of how each person is doing over the selected period of time. Now once you've inserted spark lines, you can format them. Watch what happens here though if I click on the spark line for Andy, the first spark line. You'll notice that when I select it, the cell is selected, but also the other spark lines that were created at the same time are selected. When you insert spark lines in the way that we did just now, they're basically inserted as a group. And one of the reasons that they're inserted as a group, although they all obviously refer to their own individual data, is that if you want to format them in some way, rather than have to go through what may be not just 5 but could be 50 or 500 spark lines, rather than have to go through them and individually format them, the assumption that Excel makes is that at this stage, because you've inserted them together, you want to treat them as in many ways similar, and therefore if you want to reformat them in any way, you probably want to reformat them all. Now let me show you the sort of thing that happens. Once you've got the selection there, you have the Sparkline Tools Design tab, a contextual tab. If I select that tab, watch what happens if I change that first sparkline from a line type to a column type. And what happens is that the whole of its group is changed. Now there are various other formatting things that I could do. Let me put it back to being a line again. One of the options in the show group on the design tab is high point, and what this will do for each sparkline is mark the high point. If I check that, you get the high point on each of the 5 sparklines for the members of Team A. It's possible to ungroup those sparklines, so with those selected, over on the right of this contextual design tab there is a group, and if I click on ungroup, watch what happens. Those sparklines, the set of 5, are ungrouped, and the only one that's now selected is the one that I selected at first, which is Andy's. So now if I click on column, it's only Andy's that is converted to being a column type sparkline. Okay, so let's take a look now at the design tab of the Sparkline tools. We have an edit data option on the left where we can edit group location and data, so we can go back to the original dialog, so that rather than have to change the data for each individual sparkline, where we've got a group, even if it's not formally a group, we can change the data range and corresponding location range. We've got the ability to switch between the types. I'll talk about win-loss in a moment. We then have the show options. We can show the high point, the first point, the last point, the low point. We can show negative points where we have some kind of measurement where we do have negative points. Hopefully we'll never get negative sales from any of our team, but sometimes what you're shown with sparklines is measurements against some standard, and a negative may be a bad sign. You can then choose the style. In the case of Andy's sparkline that we've currently got selected, the column type, we've got a number of color schemes there. We can choose the appropriate style, and then we can go in and change colors, marker colors, and then we've got the grouping options that I talked about just now. Now there are a couple of other very important things to realize about sparklines, and what I'm going to do with my Team A sparklines is I'm going to group them again. And I want to look at these columns in a little bit more detail. In fact, I'm going to just zoom in even a little bit more. Within the group there is another button over here, Axis, and if you click on the drop down at the bottom you can see a couple of very important options. The way that Excel 2013 does this is that it treats each individual sparkline, even the sparklines in a group, as being different and separate from the point of view of how it scales the vertical axis. So for instance, if Andy's sales were constantly twice as high as Michael's, that wouldn't really show up in these sparklines because Andy's and Michael's sparklines are based on their own individual vertical scales. And the options here that dictate that are this one in the middle, automatic for each sparkline. That's the vertical axis minimum value option. And then you have vertical axis maximum value options, automatic for each sparkline. So each sparkline is having these calculated automatically. If you want the same vertical axis for all sparklines so that you can look at them and you can really compare them with each other and not just see how each person's sales have varied over the year, you need to click Same for all sparklines in both cases. That then gives you a consistent scale on the two. And just to give you a good example of this, look at the February figures now for Andy, very low, $63, Michael's $466. You can see how much higher Michael's bar is here for that month. Now obviously if you looked at the whole team you'd see much more variations here and you get a much better idea of who's selling a lot and who isn't. Now I'm not going to go into sparklines in too much more detail now. I've got a couple of other things to point out to you, but hopefully you've got the general idea there and plenty for you to experiment with. Let me just go back down to Team B for a moment. I'm going to just click in Team B and click on High Point. You saw that before, the little markers that show the high point in sales for each member of the team. If I go back to Team A, notice that high point is marked there. I'll switch off low point, but high point is marked there. In the case of the column style of sparkline, the high point is not marked by a mark on a line as it is with the line type of sparkline. It's marked in this case by the use of a red column. So the tallest column is coloured red so that you can see where the high points are when you're using a column type of sparkline. And another point to be aware of here is that you can't actually label sparklines. You can't sort of put an x-axis label within that. However, you can cheat, and I have seen people do this. I'm not quite sure why they did it, but they did. If you've got a particular sparkline, note that sparklines are actually little transparent graphics. And if you take the cell here, B7, currently selected, if I type something in B7, it actually sits behind the sparkline. You can probably see it there. And I have seen people format what's behind a sparkline to actually simulate labeling an axis. I think that comes into the category of bizarre but true, but I have seen it done, so if you really feel like doing that, it is possible. One other thing to point out as well, and that's going to be relevant for the next exercise, which is the last one on this course, and that is that you can have sparklines for rows of data or columns of data. It just happens that I've used sparklines for a row here, but a sparkline can equally refer to a column as well. So that brings us to the last exercise on the course. So what I've done here is to adapt slightly some of the data we had earlier on. You may remember when we were looking at stock charts, we were looking at adjusted close figures. I've taken about a dozen days here for a particular stock from April 20th to May the 11th of the year 2011. And all I've done is from the adjusted close figures each day, I've worked out the change on the day. So from April 20th to April 21st, the price went from 21.10 to 21.22, which is a change of plus 12 cents. The next day it dropped 3 cents, the next it went up, down, up, etc. And I've just drawn a sparkline in column C1 here. Now the type of sparkline that I've drawn is a win-loss sparkline, and a win-loss sparkline works purely on the basis that If it's a plus, it becomes a block above the line, and if it's a minus, it becomes a block below the line. So in this case, it's a blue block above the line for a plus, a red block below the line for a minus. Doesn't take into account the value, the magnitude of the plus or minus. It's just plus or minus. And that's really all that I'd like you to do a win-loss sparkline, at least 10 days, any stock you like, any period of time you like. You can use the data that was provided earlier on, you can use the stock that I used, or you can use the stock that you used yourself if you did the equivalent exercise earlier on in the course. Simple as that, at least 10 days. My answer to that will be example 19. That's it on sparklines. I'll see you in the next section.